The fire came first, or at least that is how the old men told it years later, when their voices had thinned and their memories had softened just enough to speak. A sudden bloom of orange against a black hillside, boards snapping like dry bones under teeth, the scream of a structure that had held too many nights and finally decided to give them back all at once. Neighbors said they woke to the smell before the light, wet smoke, sharp and greasy, rolling downhill and slipping through window cracks like something that knew where to look. By the time boots hit gravel and hands found buckets, the roof had already folded inward, and whatever had been living under it was either ash or gone. They found no bodies, not in the kitchen, not tangled in the beds, not in the basement where the ground still steamed as if it had been breathing. What they did find, half fused into the dirt beneath the house, were bones too small to belong to livestock and too smooth to belong to anything that had lived cleanly. Thin arcs of ribs like pale parentheses. A jaw with teeth worn flat, not from age but from pressure, as if it had been used for something other than chewing. Someone said children. Someone else said no, not quite. The word incest was not spoken that night, but it hovered in the smoke with everything else people were afraid to name. If you listen closely to those early retellings, you can hear the hesitation, the way sentences bend away from certain details, the way the fire is blamed for erasing answers, when in truth it only made them visible for a moment. Because the house had been burning long before the match. Long before anyone admitted that screams had been heard from that hollow and explained away as foxes or owls, or the hills themselves settling. Now, before this goes any deeper, pause where you are. Notice the room around you. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? There is something about fixing a place and a moment in your mind that makes what follows harder to shake loose. The road that led to that house was not on most maps, just a thin grey suggestion that wandered off the pavement and into the trees as if it had lost confidence. Locals called the area Fowler Hollow, though no one could say exactly when the name started sticking. Census records treated it like a rounding error. A few households, shifting numbers, surnames repeating in ways that made clerks frown and then move on. Old property deeds showed the same parcel changing hands without ever really leaving one bloodline. The land itself sloped inward, a shallow bowl that caught fog and sound, and held on to both longer than it should have. People in town said the Fowlers kept to themselves because that was their nature, because hills make you private, because some families just rot quietly, but there were older whispers pressed into the margins of church ledgers and school attendance books, notes about children who enrolled late, left early, or never quite matched their paperwork, mentions of a burned house in the 1940s, another in the 1950s, each time written off as accident or lightning or carelessness, each time followed by a brief, uncomfortable silence. By the summer of 1976, that silence had grown thick enough to feel. Thick enough that when a social worker's sedan turned onto that muddy track, the forest leaned in a little closer, as if it had been waiting for someone to finally come asking the wrong questions. The county files treated Fowler Hollow like a footnote, a place mentioned only when something went wrong, and then quickly folded away again. Birth certificates stamped with delays. School reports noting absences that stretched into seasons. A handful of complaints written in cramped, nervous handwriting and never quite followed to their end. If you laid those papers out side by side, you could see the shape of avoidance in them, a careful choreography of people doing just enough to say they had looked without ever really seeing. The land itself encouraged that kind of forgetting. Hills pressed close together, shouldering out the sun by mid-afternoon, soil thin and stubborn, better at swallowing things than growing them. Old maps showed footpaths that no longer existed, leading to clearings that had been reclaimed by briar and pine. Hunters spoke of cold pockets where sound died and compasses drifted. Churches sent ministers there once or twice, then quietly reassigned them. Something about the place resisted visitors the way a wound resists being cleaned. The Fowler name appeared early in the records. Late 19th century, a man listed as a tenant farmer with no listed parents and a woman recorded only by her first name, her age marked as approximate. Their children followed in tight clusters, births separated by months that made midwives raise their eyebrows and then lower their eyes. By the 1930s, the family tree had begun to bend inward, branches looping back toward the trunk. Cousins married cousins. A daughter stayed home and never appeared on a marriage line at all, only as a second adult female in her father's household well into her 40s. Neighbors noticed things but learned not to comment. Children who did not play with others, who stood too close to the dark at dusk, as if listening for it to answer back. Lights burning in the basement at hours when decent people slept. Animals found bled out along the tree line, laid carefully on their sides, organs removed with a patience that suggested practice. When asked, the Fowlers said, "It was for food, or pests, or none of anyone's business." In the years leading up to 1976, the house on Fowler Road took on a reputation that could not be traced to a single event. A feeling, more than a story. Drivers said their radios hissed when they passed. Dogs refused to cross the property line. Children dared each other to touch the sagging porch rail and then ran screaming when the boards groaned back under their hands. Adults laughed it off, but they did not linger there either. It was into this quiet accumulation of unease that Margaret Vance drove, her tires slipping into the ruts that had been worn by the same vehicles for decades. She had read the file twice before leaving the office, and a third time at a stop sign she did not remember seeing on the way in. "Routine welfare check," the cover word said. But at the bottom of the page, someone had added a single note, small and slanted, as if afraid to take up too much space. The word was stranger. She folded the file closed as the house came into view, sitting crooked on the hillside like something that had crawled, there to die, and then changed its mind. And somewhere beneath those grey boards, the ground waited, holding its breath. The children were not seen at first. That was the detail Margaret would return to later, turning it over in her mind like a stone with one sharp edge. A house that claimed 3 young occupants and yet offered no noise, no movement, no stray toy abandoned in a corner. Even neglected homes usually carried the residue of childhood. Here, there was only stillness, arranged and deliberate. When the basement door opened and the dark breathed out its damp, metallic air, the truth began to take shape in her mind long before her flashlight found the bodies. The earth floor was not random, it had been worked, pressed and scooped by hands that returned to the same motions again and again. Troughs, measured and repeated, wide enough for a child to fit into as naturally as a cradle. The kind of space made by someone who had watched children sleep and learned what shapes they made when they were forced to stay still. The first boy did not cry when the light touched him. He did not flinch. He unfolded himself slowly, like something that had learned caution the hard way. His scalp bore scars that were not the accidents of abuse, but the handwriting of intention. Lines and circles carved into skin that had been held in place while it healed. When he spoke, his voice was soft and drained of any expectation that it might be heard differently. He said they had been found. The word hung in the basement air, heavier than the smell of wet soil. Found, not born. Found, not raised. Found the way you find a thing that already exists, hidden, and decide what to do with it next. The girl emerged from another hollow, her movements careful, her eyes tracking Margaret's face as if memorizing it. The scars on her head branched and forked, intersecting paths that looked uncomfortably like diagrams. The smallest child followed last, pressing himself into Margaret's leg with an instinct that suggested he understood safety as proximity, not permission. His wrists and ankles bore newer marks, the work not yet finished. They spoke of fixing, of a man who said they were wrong when they came to him, that their bodies needed instruction, that darkness was something to be practiced, pain something to be learned until it lost its meaning. Margaret had heard many explanations from abusers over the years, but there was something colder here, less defensive, as if the cruelty had been framed as obligation. When she brought them up into the grey light of the kitchen, the man did not deny it. He only seemed frustrated, like a craftsman interrupted before his work could set. Hiss. Poke of tests, of results that did not make sense to people in town, of hearing and seeing things others could not. His words tumbled out with the confidence of someone who believed he had been chosen for the task. It was only later, under hospital lights that flattened everything into clarity, that the second layer of wrongness revealed itself. Blood drawn from thin arms, labels applied, machines humming through their expected routines, and then the pause, the frown, the recalibration that did nothing to correct what the numbers insisted on saying. The children's DNA did not sit comfortably within known human ranges. Markers appeared where none should have been, others faded into near absence. Patterns looped and repeated with a stubborn logic that refused easy classification. It was not the messiness of inbreeding alone, though that shadow loomed large. It was something more precise, as if whatever line these children belonged to had been walking parallel to humanity for a long time and had only recently crossed back over. As the lab reports began to circulate quietly upward, those who read them felt the same unease the hills inspired, a sense of an old door cracking open, of stories once dismissed as metaphor pressing back into the room with data in their hands. And somewhere beyond the reach of Margaret's paperwork and the hospital's white walls, the roots of the Fowler family waited, tangled and deep, ready to be examined in the light they had avoided for generations. The nights were the worst, according to the nurses who worked the late shifts. Not because the children screamed, but because they did not. They lay awake with their eyes open, tracking movements in the corners of rooms that no one else could see. When the lights were dimmed, their breathing slowed instead of quickening. Heart rates settled into calm, measured rhythms more suited to trained adults than traumatized children. One nurse swore the boy could tell when someone was about to enter the ward seconds before footsteps reached the door. Another said the girl asked for the supply closet to be opened so she could sit inside it and hum, her voice vibrating softly against the shelves like a tuning fork struck too gently to hear. Social workers chalked it up to coping mechanisms. Doctors wrote cautious notes about dissociation and sensory adaptation. But the lab continued its quiet work, peeling back layers that therapy language could not touch. Immune responses mapped onto charts suggested systems primed for environments low in light and high in pressure. Pain thresholds tested higher than expected, not in bursts of adrenaline, but as a baseline. These were bodies that endured first and asked questions later. Margaret felt the split forming even as she tried to hold the case together. On one side, the children she sat with during interviews, who drew spirals and branching lines instead of houses, who asked whether basements existed everywhere or only in certain places. On the other, the reports she was not supposed to read but did anyway, hinting that the Fowler line carried markers associated with archaic human populations, long thought absorbed or extinct. Not enough to make headlines, enough to make certain offices take notice. The man from the house talked freely once the handcuffs were on, his certainty hardening rather than cracking. He spoke of family stories passed down in half-sentences and warnings, of ancestors who could move through cave systems by feel alone, of women who birthed quickly and silently because noise attracted the wrong kind of attention. He said the children had been discovered in a collapsed section of an old mine on property that had belonged to the family since before the county existed. He said they had not known how to speak at first, but they listened, always listened. What he did not volunteer, but what genealogists later traced with shaking fingers, was how closely he himself was tied to the blood he claimed to be correcting. His mother and his aunt were the same woman, recorded twice under different names after a hurried remarriage. His wife shared a grandfather with him and a great-grandmother besides. The family tree did not just fold in on itself, it knotted. Generation after generation of unions that reduced the outside world to a rumor. When this surfaced quietly and without ceremony, the town reacted the way towns often do when faced with a reflection they cannot stand to see. Animals were put down. Records went missing. The church held closed-door meetings and emerged with statements about forgiveness and the dangers of speculation. A group of men drove out to Fowler Road one night with cans of gasoline and a sense of grim purpose. By morning, the house was a blackened shell, the basement filled in by machines that did not ask what they were burying. Officially, the fire was an accident. Unofficially, it was a cleansing, an attempt to cauterize something that had festered too close to the surface. The children were moved again, then again, each transfer stripping more names and replacing them with numbers. Researchers in the 1980s would later uncover fragments, photographs with faces scratched out, audio tapes of interviews that cut off mid-sentence, DNA samples logged under projects that never published results. Always the same conclusion reached and then abandoned. These were not just victims of abuse, they were evidence of something older, something the Hills had kept long before paperwork existed. And as Margaret stood at the edge of the burned clearing, watching smoke lift into a sky that pretended nothing had happened, she understood the final cruelty of the Fowler case. The town had not destroyed a secret. It had ensured it would be carried elsewhere, inside living bodies that would grow, remember, and adapt. The truth about the family did not arrive all at once. It leaked, slowly, through margins and footnotes, through the uncomfortable labor of people whose job it was to connect names to names and dates to blood. In a county office 2 towns over, a woman tasked with updating old genealogical charts noticed that the Fowler records behaved strangely. Lines that should have branched instead curved back. Spouses shared surnames before marriage and after. Birth years overlapped in ways that suggested not scandal, but design. At the center of it sat the man from the house, his lineage folded so tightly it was difficult to tell where one generation ended and another began. His mother appeared twice in the books, once as a daughter, once as a wife, her own father listed as unknown, though the margin bore a faint pencil mark, later erased, that matched a name already written elsewhere on the page. The implication was not a single forbidden union, but a practice. A habit passed down with the same inevitability as eye color or bone structure. The girl's scars began to make a different kind of sense when viewed through this lens, not just symbols, but maps, branches that doubled back, paths that ended where they began. The boys' circles, closed and repeated, like loops with no exit. The children had not been taught family history from books or stories. It had been carved into them, literally and methodically, as if flesh were the only medium trusted to hold the truth. When confronted with the genealogical findings, the man did not deny them. He seemed almost relieved. He spoke of blood that had to be kept close because dilution weakened it, of traits that disappeared when outsiders were introduced. Hearing that could pierce stone, eyes that adjusted to dark without fear, bodies that healed differently. He said the family had learned long ago that survival meant choosing each other over the world. The town recoiled when word spread, though most claimed they had suspected something for years. Incest was the word used publicly, heavy and final, a way to close the discussion. But privately, another fear took root. Not just that the Fowlers had been breeding wrong, but that they had been breeding towards something, that the isolation had not degraded them in the way everyone expected, but refined them instead. Children who did not cry at night, adults who navigated caves and basements like open fields, a tolerance for confinement that bordered on comfort. These were framed as symptoms of abuse, and many of them were. But the data complicated the moral clarity people wanted. Certain markers were too consistent, too persistent across generations. They suggested not random damage, but selection. Church elders pushed hard for silence. Sermons turned toward themes of purity and correction, of burning out rot before it spread. The fire on Fowler Road was never mentioned by name, but everyone knew what it meant. A symbolic erasure meant to reassure the town that the line had been cut. It had not been. By the late 1980s, a researcher cataloging rare genetic variants stumbled across a cluster of anonymized samples that refused to sort properly. 3 individuals, same region, same odd repetitions. The notes attached were sparse and defensive, warning against overinterpretation. Still, the researcher felt the pull of it, the sense of a pattern half seen before slipping back into shadow. She requested access to sealed files. She was denied. She filed appeals. Some were granted, others quietly disappeared. What she did obtain were copies of old photographs taken under hospital lights. 3 children with shaved heads, eyes too alert, standing in a row as if waiting for instruction. The incest had been real, the abuse undeniable, but layered beneath it was something else, something the town had tried to burn away without understanding it. A lineage that had turned inward not out of ignorance alone, but out of an inherited memory of the dark. Once the word incest had been spoken aloud, it became a tool, a blunt one, useful for shutting doors and ending conversations. The town seized it eagerly because it allowed everything else to be framed as sickness rather than responsibility. If the Fowlers were simply degenerate, then no one had to explain why teachers ignored patterns, why deputies drove past the road without turning their heads, why neighbors learned to translate screams into wildlife and sleep through them. The reaction was not loud, it was procedural. Animals on adjacent properties were culled as a precaution. Old sheds were torn down. A box of church records from the 1920s vanished during a routine cleaning, its absence noted only by the dust left behind. The county issued a short statement about tragic circumstances and reassured the public that there was no ongoing threat. Threat, in this case, meant contagion, not conscience. Children who had once played near Fowler Hollow were warned away from the area with stories that shifted shape depending on the teller. Some said there were traps in the woods, others said the ground was poisoned. No one said there were people there who had been failed for generations. It was easier to imagine the land itself as cursed. The burned house became a landmark of absence. Teenagers drove out at night to stare at the blackened frame and feel brave. Older residents crossed themselves when passing. The basement was filled in quickly, the earth leveled and packed until it looked no different from the surrounding slope. But when rain came hard, the soil settled unevenly, leaving shallow depressions that filled with water and reflected the sky like open eyes. Margaret tried to push back against the erasure and found how little leverage she truly had. Her reports were returned with sections redacted, meetings were cancelled. She was thanked for her service and encouraged to focus on other cases. The children were no longer referred to by name in any document she could access. They were cases, then numbers, then nothing at all. In private, she wrote letters she never sent, to oversight boards, to journalists, to anyone she thought might listen. She described the scars, the basement, the way the children stood when unsure, weight balanced as if ready for sudden drops. Most of those letters ended up in a drawer she rarely opened, because rereading them made her feel complicit in a way she could not articulate. Years passed. The town healed the way towns often do, by growing new layers over old ones. New families moved in who had never heard the name Fowler. The road was graded. The clearing grew wild again. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, it circulated in places that did not answer to town councils or church elders, in university labs, in federal offices where anomalies were tracked rather than dismissed. The same 3 samples surfaced again and again, flagged, debated, set aside, always accompanied by the same uneasy note: origin unclear, context incomplete. By the time a researcher in the late 1980s finally traced those samples back to a burned house and a sealed county file, the story had already begun to change. Less about crime, less about scandal, more about inheritance, about what happens when a family folds in on itself not to hide, but to remember something the rest of the world forgot. The researcher's name rarely appears in what remains of the record, only an initial and a series of dates written in the margins of photocopied reports. She worked out of a converted lab space that still smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, the kind of place where past projects lingered like ghosts. Her interest was not the scandal, or even the abuse. It was the pattern. The way the Fowler samples refused to behave like anything else in her datasets. She compared them against known cases of extreme inbreeding, against isolated island populations, against families that had lived for centuries in mountain valleys or desert basins. None of it quite fit. Inbreeding explained the fragility you expected, the errors, the collapses, but the Fowler data showed reinforcement in unexpected places, redundancy where weakness should have been, systems that compensated rather than failed. Digging deeper meant digging sideways, into anthropology texts written in the early 20th century and quietly abandoned, into field notes from expeditions that never made it into mainstream journals. She found references to so-called troglodytic populations, people rumored to live underground for generations, emerging rarely and reluctantly. Most modern scholars dismissed these as folklore or misidentified hermits, but some of the old descriptions made her pause, eyes adjusting quickly to torchlight, children trained not to cry, kinship structures that prioritized continuity over taboo. She requested additional background on the Fowler land and received only partial responses, deeds that skipped decades, mining records that mentioned collapses no one remembered authorizing, a hand-drawn map tucked into an envelope by someone who did not include a return address, marking tunnels that did not appear on any official survey. When she overlaid the map with the known geography, the lines converged beneath the filled-in basement. The children themselves were harder to track. By then, they had been absorbed into the system so thoroughly that even deliberate searching turned up only fragments. A medical check here, a transfer order there, a notation about unusual night behavior crossed out and replaced with a more acceptable term. The boy disappeared from all records in his late teens. The girl surfaced briefly in a state facility, then vanished again. The youngest left behind a single file note that read simply, "Placement declined, subject unsuitable." What unsettled the researcher most was not their disappearance, but the tone of the documents surrounding it. There was no alarm, no language of loss, just a quiet finality, as if the system had reached the end of its obligation and closed its hands. In her private notebook, she wrote questions she could not publish. Was the abuse an attempt to suppress traits that frightened the man, or to enhance them? Had the family's R&D breeding been desperation, or strategy? And what happened when the children were removed from the environment that had shaped them for generations? She never answered those questions. Funding shifted. Her access was curtailed. The Fowler samples were reclassified and moved into long-term storage. When she pressed for justification, she was reminded gently of boundaries and strongly of consequences. Years later, when she packed up her office, she kept one copy of a photograph she was not supposed to have. 3 children standing under harsh light, eyes reflecting more than the room contained. On the back, in her own hand, she had written a single line, "Not broken." Adapted. By the early 1990s, the Fowler case existed only as an echo, a reference number without a file, a footnote that pointed to another footnote and then stopped. New researchers inherited sanitized databases where anomalies had been averaged out and context removed. To them, the children were statistical noise, their oddities smoothed into curves that meant nothing without a story attached. Margaret retired quietly. She moved to a smaller town and stopped driving mountain roads unless she had to. In the boxes she took with her were copies of reports she was never meant to keep, and a single map she had sketched from memory, marking the troughs in the basement and the path she had walked with the children pressed close behind her. She did not show these to anyone. They were not evidence anymore. They were reminders. Occasionally she thought she saw one of them, a young man standing too comfortably in the shadowed corner of a bus station, a woman in a grocery store aisle, humming softly to herself as the lights flickered. These moments passed quickly and left her unsure whether she was recognizing faces or patterns. Trauma does that, she told herself. It teaches you to see ghosts. In Fowler Hollow, the land continued its slow work. Trees rooted into the filled-in cellar. Rain carved shallow channels where the earth had never quite settled. Hunters still reported strange acoustics in that patch of woods, sounds swallowed or thrown back distorted. A few claimed to have found openings after heavy storms, narrow and quickly collapsing, as if the ground itself corrected any attempt to look too closely. The idea that humanity might not be as singular as it liked to believe did not gain traction publicly. It lived instead in private conversations, in the margins of conferences, in the uneasy laughter that followed certain questions. Every so often, a paper would appear suggesting survival of archaic traits in modern populations, only to be debated into obscurity. The Fowler data was never cited by name, but it hovered behind those discussions like a shape just out of focus. What remained certain was this: the town's attempt at erasure had failed in the only way that mattered. You can burn a house, you can fill in a basement, you can scatter records and rename children, but you cannot easily undo a lineage that has already learned how to endure pressure, darkness, and silence. Some nights, Margaret dreamed of the hum she thought she heard in the basement, a vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. In the dream it deepened, resolving into footsteps moving through earth, measured and unhurried. She would wake with the sense that something had passed beneath her, not threatening, just aware. The Fowler children had been labeled many things over the years: victims, evidence, anomalies. None of those names captured the unease they left behind, because the most disturbing possibility was never written down in any report, that they were not the end of a story, but a continuation. There is a question that surfaces whenever the Fowler case is spoken anew, in low voices, usually at the very end, when everyone involved has already decided not to pursue it too far. It is not about guilt or science or even cruelty. It is simpler, and because of that, more dangerous. What would you do if you learned that your family tree did not branch outward, but inward? If the names you thought were separate were echoes of the same few people, repeating themselves to preserve something fragile and old? If your mother was also your sister? If your father was also your uncle? If the shame you were taught to feel was not a mistake, but a deliberate barrier meant to keep outsiders from asking why? The Fowler children were raised in darkness and pain, yes, that truth does not soften. But the deeper horror lies in what surrounded that pain, the sense that the abuse was not random, not drunken or impulsive, but ritualized, directed, framed as preparation. The man believed he was correcting errors introduced by time and dilution. He believed he was restoring something closer to an original state. When the system intervened, it focused on what it knew how to punish: incest, confinement, assault. Those charges fit neatly into statutes and reports. What it could not address was inheritance, the way certain traits do not disappear just because you remove the environment that shaped them, the way bodies remember even when paperwork insists they forget. Somewhere, those children grew up. They learned how to navigate a world that was too bright, too loud, too open. Or perhaps they found their way back to spaces that felt familiar. Underground transit tunnels, utility corridors, old mines repurposed as storage. Places where ceilings are low and sound behaves predictably. Places where you can hear someone coming long before they arrive. Officially, the Fowler line ended in a fire and a sealed case. Unofficially, it dispersed, adapted, became hard. To trace. The blood that puzzled technicians in 1976 did not vanish. It flowed forward, diluted perhaps, but carrying its repetitions like a quiet refrain. The hills around Fowler Hollow still settle after heavy rain, still open and close in ways surveyors cannot quite explain. And there are still people who swear that if you stand there at night, long after the road has gone quiet, you can feel movement beneath your feet, not digging, not escaping, just passing through as if the ground itself were a hallway. So consider it carefully. If you uncovered proof that your family's survival depended on secrets, on unions the world forbids, on adapting to places humans were never meant to stay for long, would you expose it? Or would you do what the town did, burn the house, fill in the basement, and hope whatever learned to live in the dark stays there? There is a question that surfaces whenever the Fowler case is mentioned in the spaces where people lower their voices without realizing it. It does not appear in reports or lectures. It is never written down. It waits until the end, when all the facts have been exhausted and only unease remains. What would you do if you discovered that your family was never meant to spread outward, only inward? That the names on your birth records were mirrors, not branches? That your mother was also your sister? That your father carried the same blood twice over? That the shame wrapped around those facts was not an accident, but a protective layer, grown deliberately to keep strangers from asking the wrong questions? The Fowler children were harmed. That truth stands untouched. But beneath it lay a more unsettling one. The cruelty was not chaotic. It was structured. The scars were not random. They repeated. The confinement was not punishment alone, but training. Darkness, pressure, silence, rehearsed until the body stopped resisting. Them. When the authorities intervened, they acted against what they could name. Incest, abuse, illegal confinement, words that fit cleanly into laws and courtrooms. What they could not prosecute was inheritance. The way certain traits persist even when environments change. The way a nervous system shaped for darkness does not forget simply because the lights are turned on. Somewhere, the Fowler children became adults. They learned to move through a world that was too open, too bright, too exposed. Or they gravitated toward places that felt familiar: subways, Service tunnels, basements beneath buildings that never sleep, spaces where ceilings are low and sound travels honestly, places where you can hear footsteps long before you see a face. Officially, the Fowler line ended in fire and sealed files, a house reduced to ash, a basement filled in and smoothed over, a case number marked closed. But blood does not obey paperwork. It moves forward quietly, carrying its repetitions like a memory the body refuses to release. The hills around Fowler Hollow still shift after heavy rain. The ground still settles unevenly, as if correcting itself. Hunters still complain that sound behaves strangely there, and a few people standing alone at night when the road is empty say they feel movement beneath their feet. Not digging, not escaping, just passing through, as though the earth itself were a corridor. So sit with the question the town never answered. If you learned that your survival depended on forbidden unions, on secrets older than law, on adapting to places humans were never meant to linger, would you expose it, or would you do what they did? Burn the house, bury the evidence, and hope whatever learned to live in the dark remembers how to stay there.